From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
House Republicans propose a bill to raise the federal debt ceiling by about $1.5 trillion in return for slower federal spending, reform of green energy subsidies, and work rules for food stamps and Medicaid benefits if you are able-bodied. President Biden responds by saying he still won't negotiate and calls the House ideas wacko. Can Republicans pass their bill in the House? And if they do, will the president have to negotiate with the wackos? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and I'm here with a couple of my colleagues, Kate Batchelder-Odell and Kim Strassel. Kevin McCarthy, the speaker, rolled out his bill this week, and they hope to have a vote on it as early as next week in the House. Let's listen to his challenge to President Biden.
President Biden has a choice. Come to the table and stop playing partisan political games. Or cover his ears, refuse to negotiate, and risk bumbling his way into the first default in our nation's history.
Kim, you've looked at some of the details here. Kind of tell us about the highlights of what's in the bill. What are they asking for in return for this debt ceiling increase, and anything that's surprising to you?
Yeah, so here's what they're asking for. In return for raising the debt limit by about $1.5 trillion, or until March of next year, whichever comes first, Republicans are asking for a return to spending levels that were fiscal 2022. So a reduction in current spending limits, but not that much. They are asking to take back the $80 billion that was provided to the IRS to turbocharge that agency. They want to return to the status quo ante on a number of clean energy tax credits that were all bulked up last year as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. These are things like supersized credits for electric vehicles, etc. They would bar the president from waving his magic wand and eliminating student loan debt. They would speed up permitting for energy projects. And then they do have some very modest work requirements in there saying that Americans who are able-bodied and who do not have children would have to fulfill some work requirements in order to be able to access Medicaid and certain food benefits. Nothing in here is actually that big of a surprise. In fact, I consider these to be very straightforward asks, and the kind of things in this regard, I think Republicans were smart. The kind of things that most Americans would think, I think, are fairly reasonable requests given the alarming state of current spending and the debt we have. So that's going to be their offer.
Yeah, by one measure I've seen, Dan Clifton of Strategas kind of added up what the total spending reductions would be over 10 years if the whole Republican ask were accepted, including the caps. And it's really about $4 trillion or so over 10 years. Now you say, oh boy, that sounds like a lot. Well, remember, the annual federal budget is now $6 trillion. So, that's times 10, $60 trillion. And of course, it would grow over time. So you're probably talking about $70 or $75 trillion over 10 years. And $4 trillion out of that is hardly something that is really extraordinary. Nonetheless, the president is not going to accept this outright. I think Republicans know that. They're trying to put an offer on the table that can get 218 votes. And Kate, elaborate a little bit for us on particularly the work requirements for Medicaid and food stamps, which the Democrats seem to be attacking as somehow a tremendous reduction in the American safety net.
Yeah, Paul. So in Medicaid, there is currently not a requirement that you work as a condition of receiving benefits. And Medicaid has been expanded as part of Obamacare to millions of particularly prime-age men above the poverty line who don't have children. And in food stamps, there is a kind of putative work requirement on the books, but it has been waived by the COVID emergency. And there have also been COVID emergency measures that have precluded states from paring back their Medicaid rolls. So what Republicans want to do here is say, for instance, on Medicaid, if you're receiving Medicaid and you don't have children, you're able to work, you're not disabled, you're not receiving substance abuse treatment, you have to work or volunteer or train for a job for 20 hours a week. I think it's important to be clear about that because the Democratic attack line here are so vicious when in reality, this is a requirement that able-bodied adults work part-time. And I really think, is that a wacko position to most Americans? And I think it goes to a broader question of what are the culture of these programs and are they aimed at getting Americans back to work or back in better circumstances as a temporary safety net? Or are they morphing into kind of European-style entitlements, which is what I think is going on?
Just to elaborate on this a little bit, you're talking about somebody who might be 35 years old, no disabilities to speak of, no drug addiction, no dependents who would depend on you to be at home. They're saying that if you want government-paid health care benefits and if you want food stamps, you will actually have to get a job. Right? Is it that simple, Kate? And not even a full-time job, but 20 hours a week. Or if you want to, I guess you can volunteer at the United Way for 20 hours.
Absolutely, Paul. And, the Democrats say, well, these families are already working really hard. If that's true, then nobody should oppose a part-time job requirement. But the truth is, Paul, there's increasingly a problem in this country of prime-age men who are out of the labor force entirely. Nick Eberstadt, other demographers have looked at it very closely. And the truth is there are households in America where there are no earnings. That is not a good economic or social prospect for America. And so this is a very modest reform, try to help those in that situation get back to work and get a job.
All right, let's listen to how President Biden responded to the House proposal.
Mega Republicans in Congress are threatening to default on the national debt, the debt that took 230 years to accumulate overall, unless we do what they say. They say they're going to default unless I agree to all these wacko notions they have. Default would be worse than totally irresponsible. It would mean cuts in Social Security and Medicare, higher interest rates for things like credit cards, car loans, mortgages. Working people, middle class, seniors would pay the price for the entire economy would be at risk. America's never defaulted on our debt, which has accumulated over 200 years.
So he's taking it well, Kim?
Wacko.
Yeah, I think he's taking rhetoric lessons from Donald Trump. But, so he's sticking to his position that he's not going to negotiate. Certainly, he's trying to put pressure on the House Republicans to be able to pass this bill. And that really is the first threshold here to getting to any kind of a resolution. Just to put out the timing on this, the expectation now is that the debt ceiling might be reached and sometime in early June, could still stretch into July. We don't know what the pace of federal revenues will be. But let's say it does happen in June. It's coming pretty quickly. So Kevin McCarthy getting his members together to vote on this next week to pass it is crucial here if he wants to have any leverage, Kim. What are the prospects now getting to 218?
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering the history more recently of how we got here. Remember, McCarthy and Biden met in early February. That's nearly 80 days ago. At the time, Biden said, I'm going to show you my budget, you show me yours. And the White House strategy was attempt to pressure the Republicans to put out a budget resolution before they would talk. McCarthy, I think, wisely took that off the table and said, no, in fact, that has no relation to what we're talking about at the moment.
The annual budget is separate from the debt ceiling, yeah.
Exactly. Instead, if you want to know what we're going to give you here, this is what we're actually talking about in terms of getting a debt ceiling hike. This is what we're asking in return. Look, I think it's really important to note how much effort went into this. This has been 2 months of McCarthy and his team engaging in listening sessions with all of their members, bringing in 6 to 10 people at a time. I saw a report from the Republican Study Committee chair, Kevin Hern from Oklahoma, saying that he had been in at least 10 of those meetings in the last couple of months. So there's been a real effort to get everybody heard and get them on the same page. And to that prospects point, Paul, it does look pretty decent. You're having a few people grouse here and there. Nancy Mace from South Carolina saying, I'm leaning toward no because we're not talking about a balanced budget. I mean, that's a bit insane. Everyone understands.
That's such a fraud.
It is. I know.
This is a sort of a small step to getting to some kind of balanced budget. The national deficit in the first 6 months of this year was $1.1 trillion. I mean, she'd never in a million years vote for a balanced budget.
Well, right, because to do so, you'd essentially have to start hacking at Social Security and Medicare and everything else. It took a while to get into this position, and it's going to take a while to dig out. And that has been McCarthy's message. But, you and I have both been through some of these GOP fights before under Boehner and Ryan. This doesn't feel like that, where you had an entire portion of the caucus revolting, screaming, saying, no way, we'll never go there. I saw Scott Perry, the head of the Freedom Caucus, say, I'd like to see a few revisions in the language. A few good things need to be cleaned up. But, pretty much people are there. So I think he's got a good shot of getting across the line, especially because a number of Senate Republicans have now come up to back him and say that they're not willing to do some sort of deal with Schumer for a clean debt limit. That gives him more momentum, too.
And that means that the Republicans in the Senate won't, at least at this stage, undercut the House, because by implying that they will vote for the Democrats on a clean debt limit and the bill that would get 60 votes in the Senate and then would force McCarthy and the House to act to avoid a default. In this case, you have McCarthy acting first and saying, see, we're acting to raise the debt limit. We're not going to default. We don't want to default. But, Mr. President, we just want a few things in return. Kate, how do you see the politics here in the House evolving?
Well, I think one key thing for House Republicans, obviously they have to pass it. It's a no-fail mission, and they are on firm political ground. I think that's important to point out, that a lot of the things they're asking for poll in the 80%. Their energy bill that passed the House recently with Democratic support is popular. Also, we had an election in Wisconsin recently where Democrats did very well, but a referendum about whether childless adults should work in exchange for benefits passed in an 80% margin. So they are asking for things that the president should be amenable to if he's serious about raising the debt ceiling. So I am hopeful that they will pass this and stick to their guns, because if they got even some of it, I think it would be helpful for the country, especially on permitting reform, which is so desperately needed to get projects started in this country, or even just minor compromises on the work requirements so that more people would work, or that these agencies would at least consider part of their mission being getting back to work. There is room here for them to get something. So I think hopefully they look more united now than they have in dramas past. And the question is if they can stick to that.